Buying a car is already a pretty stressful experience if you're like most people, especially if you're buying a used car. You want to make sure you get a good deal, you want to make sure that's a reliable car, not to mention that you want to actually enjoy the car. And here's a crazy stat for you. On average, you spend up to 18 days, all the way to 30 days, a full month, in your actual car per year. If your average commute is 1 hour one way and 1 hour back the other way, that means 2 hours out of a 24-hour day you actually spend in your car. So you really want to make sure that you enjoy your car and that's very reliable. And one of the best ways to make sure you get a great deal on a car and still get the car that you want is to buy a used car. And I actually did a whole separate video on how to buy a used car from a private seller that I'll link down below as well. But I wanted to talk about it from the perspective of buying from a dealership, because there's a lot of people out there, while buying from a private seller can certainly result in a great deal, a lot of people feel more comfortable going to a dealership, or it's just, that's their different goals, right? Some people want to buy a certified pre-owned car, so that's why they go to a dealership. And as someone who's benefited from having family members that have automotive backgrounds, such as ranging all the way from car technicians, vehicle inspectors, as well as a mechanic, so I wanted to share that same knowledge that I've benefited from to others out there that may be watching. Now, I'm going to briefly explain what to look out for when buying a used car. And obviously, you have to cater this advice to your own needs. If you have a family and you have a job where it's really important to have a reliable car, then you're going to probably want to cater towards like a younger car with less miles, or, a bigger size car, and that's going to have to fit into your budget somehow. So, you really have to cater this advice to your own needs. As far as the age for the car, I generally recommend anywhere between 3 years all the way up to 7 years. You can actually push that all the way to as new as 2 years, all the way as old as 10 years. But in general, I try to stick within that 3 to 7 years, because that's generally reliable enough that you don't necessarily have to worry about the car breaking down, as well as you're still making sure you're getting a good deal. When you push up to that 2-year range, you can still sometimes get a great deal, but when you're buying from a dealership in particular, it's going to be a lot tougher to get a great deal. And the age of the car is going to heavily depend on what car you actually end up getting. For example, if you get a Toyota 4Runner, you can actually push that to 10 years or even beyond 10 years and still have that be a pretty reliable car. But for example, if you go with a Jeep Wrangler, which is one of the cars that typically shows up on a lot of least reliable cars list, then that's probably a car you don't want to push too far as being too old. As far as mileage for the car, I generally recommend between 30,000 miles all the way up to 100,000 miles. 100,000 miles used to be pretty much the standard as far as buying a used car. You don't want to go beyond that. That's actually getting pushed out a little bit further now because cars are being developed into newer and higher quality standards. So you can actually find a lot of great deals between 100 and 125 or even 150,000 miles. But like I said, one of the best things to probably do is Google search out there top 10 most reliable cars for the actual year you're looking for. A good example of that would be, let's say Toyota has pretty much always been reliable, but different brands, let's say Hyundai, has actually been more reliable as of recent, but not necessarily so much in the past. So you have to make sure that you're looking at the specific year you care about. And once you get a general sense, Google search a couple lists, not just rely on one, and see what are the top 10 most reliable cars, top least reliable cars, and then you can kind of build a gauge on whether or not it makes sense to push up that mileage to 100 to 125,000 miles, versus if it's a less reliable car, then I'd probably want to risk pushing it beyond 100,000 miles. There are also two considerations when you're weighing out how much mileage you're willing to buy as far as a car. One being whether or not you can actually make repairs yourself. If I know that I can do a lot of small repairs myself, then pushing up that mileage isn't necessarily so big of a deal, because obviously as a car has more miles, it's going to have more frequent of repairs. And if I can do that myself, then I'm probably going to get a good deal. But if I can't do that myself, then that's a premium I'm going to have to pay down the road. The second thing to care about is whether or not there's going to be any major repairs that are recommended pretty soon. A lot of cars used to have timing belts that used to be changed out at 100,000 miles or even 80,000 miles for some makes and models. Then you would care about that, right? If you bought a 90,000 mile car, you want to make sure that that timing belt has been changed. And if not, you want to negotiate that into the price. Or if you don't necessarily want to negotiate down on price, you can better negotiate to have the repair done by the dealership, because from their perspective is most beneficial and the cheapest option usually for them to make the repair themselves. So for example, if they have to replace the brakes, it's cheaper for them to do it than it is for you to negotiate down the price, and it's definitely going to be cheaper for them to do it than it is for you to go down to a different mechanic and have them do it down later. Now, as far as the make and model of a car, the two general recommendations I think that people should be caring about is the maintenance on the car, the expected repairs and maintenance average per year, as well well as the reliability of the car. And when it comes to reliability, I tend to be a little bit biased here, but for good reason, which is I tend to favor Toyota as my brand of choice when it comes to reliability. But as always, I don't necessarily think you should just take one person's word for that. Google search out there, top most reliable brands and see any commonalities. Don't just rely on one article to tell you what is the most reliable brand out there, and see if, there's a couple of brands out there that frequently pop on different lists, and that's most likely a really reliable brand. Now, the second thing I was saying was the average repairs and maintenance per year, because most cars are either going to fall off of warranty pretty soon when you're buying a used car, or they're not necessarily under warranty anymore at all. So you want to really make sure you have a good understanding as far as the average repairs and maintenance that, is going to be expected. Now, when it comes to general repairs and maintenance costs and figuring out what to expect, there's basically two ways to do it. One's kind of a more imprecise but quick, easy method, and the second one I'll touch on in a second. But the first one being that you can just see in your area what are the most common type cars. This doesn't necessarily always work because, example, you could have area where Chevy Impalas are really popular, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the repairs and maintenance are that cheap. But the reason this typically works is because if I live in an area where Honda Civics are, that's one of the most common cars, also one of the cars that typically gets its tires taken off pretty frequently. But if Honda Civics are really common in my area, then mechanics have the tools and equipment needed to do those repairs, so it's going to be a lot cheaper for them to do those repairs. So just because a car is less expensive does not necessarily mean the repairs and maintenance is going to be cheap. For example, Alfa Romeo is a brand out there that's not necessarily too common, but you can actually end up buying an Alfa Romeo that's a lot cheaper than, let's say, a more expensive Lexus. And that Lexus actually may have repairs and maintenance that are a little bit cheaper simply because you have mechanics that are more familiar with Lexuses, whereas they may not necessarily be familiar with Alfa Romeo. Obviously, this kind of goes without saying, but the more exotic cars or the cars that typically have brands or makes that are less common, those are going to end up having more specialized tools, so the repairs and maintenance are going to be more expensive on that. And the second method, which is actually more precise to get a general sense for the repairs and maintenance, is to just go on O'Reilly's or AutoZone and search actual different things. Search the cost of a battery, the cost of an alternator or starter, as well as any brake parts or suspensions or different things like that. Those are things that you can actually really gauge on how expensive or cheap a car is going to be. Tires is another great example. Not all tires can fit on all cars out there, so you want to make sure you have a general sense of how much it's going to cost to replace all the tires. Now, the next step when buying a car, used car from a dealership anyways, is to have a budget, which obviously seems like it makes sense, but I feel like most people end up just having a number that they don't necessarily want to go beyond. But what I actually recommend here is make sure you have a general range as far as your budget. Because if you get in the mindset of $10,000 as my max budget, then there's almost a 95% chance that you're going to end up spending pretty close to that $10,000 budget, because when it comes to a $9,000 car versus a $10,000 car, I like the $10,000 car more, so that's what I'm going to go with. But thinking of your budget in terms of a range ends up causing you to make sure that you know that you're going to be valuing different cars. So you really have to think about what are the different features and things you value in a car and put an actual price tag on that. When I think about having Bluetooth in my car as well as a sunroof on my car, what do I actually value as far as that? Put a number to that. So if I value at that $500, when I go to see a Toyota that I was willing to pay $8,000 for, and they show me one with the sunroof and Bluetooth that I didn't necessarily really want, but I would be willing to pay, if they charge me more than $800, then I know that's a car I don't necessarily want. Versus if you just have this top of the line budget, you wouldn't necessarily know that. And when it comes to telling the dealership, because there's a pretty good chance that they're going to ask you right away, what's your budget for your car, you can actually tell them that lower range. And so then if they end up pushing you beyond that range, you can feel pretty good that you're actually still within your budgeted range, and on their minds they feel like they're winning because they pushed you beyond your budget. The other reason you want to be in this mindset of having a general range, and I say that when it comes to regards of mileage, age, as well as your budget, is because there's a good chance that if you go into a dealership and have a specific set of mileage as well as a specific budget, you're not going to have that car right away. They're going to tell you, well, we don't have a car in that price range, let me show you something else. And from a car dealership salesman's perspective, one of the best things for them to do is basically make the decision-making process pretty abstract in your mind. So if I go in wanting a Toyota for $5,000 and I just want a basic car, they say, well, we don't have that in terms of, $5,000 in that mileage. Let me show you the $6,000 car that's a luxury car. It's a Lexus, actually. It's really hard for you to value that on whether or not you're getting a good deal, so you end up walking out with a car you didn't really give much thought into. So that's why it's really beneficial to have this range of criteria, because you can basically make sure that the car fits in with your range of criteria or not. And from the dealership's perspective as well, one of the other things they really love to do is basically confuse you with the finance option, which I'll do 2 separate videos talking talking about whether or not certified pre-owned is worth it, and as well as whether or not you should be financing through the dealership. But in general, what I'd say here, one of the best things to look out for is how they're going to kind of confuse you in that decision. You're looking at a car that's $6,000. You say, I'd like to pay only $5,000 for that car. Well, when you get into the finance negotiation, what they ended up doing is, sure, they ended up dropping down the principal price to $5,000, but they ended up increasing the interest rate, or perhaps they ended up shortening the loan, or maybe they lengthened the loan to get that monthly payment that you wanted. You're only wanting to pay $300 a month. They agree to it, but what they do is they charge, an immense amount of interest rate. And so it's really hard to look out for all those different things. But, once again, just be really vigilant and aware that if you're negotiating on one aspect, they may be trying to kind of not necessarily play too fair on a different aspect. So before you even head to the dealership, make sure you have that budget, you have that range criteria as far as age and mileage, and you have a couple of lists as far as makes and models of cars that you're actually interested in before you head to the dealership. And one of the other things to watch out as far as car salesmen that they love to do is they end up taking advantage of the fact that you're probably going to get fatigued throughout the car buying process. And because of that, you're going to end up making a decision, at least a little bit of a hasty decision, ended up overpaying. You really have to understand the biggest leverage that you have over car dealerships is the fact that there's plenty of other used cars out there, not only on that specific lot, but plenty of other dealerships that you could take your business to. So if they're not necessarily willing to negotiate with you or take your, they're not letting you take your time, they have to understand that you're willing to go to another dealership. But if you're not willing to do that, then you're losing your biggest leverage you have against them. One simple, quick, and easy tip as far as if you're in a relationship or you already have your own family is to basically go to the car dealership by yourself initially while you're doing kind of that research phase, seeing what you like and don't like. Because then, if I'm a husband to, and I didn't necessarily bring my wife to buying this car, then it's very easy for me to say, well, I don't necessarily like to make this big of a decision without my wife here. I just wanted to kind of get a general sense for, researching what kind of car I like. They're probably going to back off and maybe not even necessarily give you the care and attention that you deserve because they know you're not necessarily going to buy a car. But better that than them pressuring you into buying a car you didn't necessarily want. The other thing I'd highly recommend people understand is the fact that a car salesman is not necessarily an expert at the car you're looking at. One of the best things to do when buying a used car, especially from a private seller, is make sure you understand, you ask them questions because then it ends up sending up red flags. If I'm asking about, a certain scratch on a car and they end up telling me a story or kind of hinting at a story that they got in a car wreck, well, they may not necessarily have disclosed that right away, but me asking and prying questions ended up disclosing that information. But when it comes to a dealership, there's a good chance that they don't even know about this car in the lot anyways. And if they do, it's probably a vague knowledge. It's not necessarily a car that they drove themselves. In fact, not only do they not usually know enough about the car, but in general, the car salesmen don't even have to know much as far as cars as well. So if you ask them specific questions, whether or not this looks normal to them, they're probably just, especially if it's a yes or no question, they're just right away going to say yes. Or what they'll allude to is the fact that, well, it's passed our 128 point, inspection check, so everything's good to go. But the problem with that is, those inspection lists tend to be kind of laughable to a degree. While they do inspect some things, one of the most critical parts of any car is the actual internal components of the engine. And that's something that's very, very difficult to get an inspection on, at least, the versions that most car dealerships are doing. Usually they look at a tire and they wiggle it around and they say, well, that's one inspection point. And we visually inspected it as well as physically inspected. So actually that's 2 points right there. So they end up having all these different kind of inspection points that really are insignificant, but it ends up seeming pretty big when they can say, we inspect 128 points of this car. So the internal parts of the engine are one of the most important parts on deciding whether or not a used car is a good deal or not. How would you know? Because you can't necessarily look inside the engine. Well, one of the best ways to do that is basically get indicators that indicated that the previous owner did or didn't take too well of their car. For example, if the washer fluid is low or the oil is dirty or something like that, then you know that the owner probably didn't take too well of their car. Obviously, the dealership could have gone ahead and changed the oil and filled up the washer fluid. So other things like stains or scratches on the door or something like that, that may indicate that the previous owner didn't necessarily take too well of their car. The other aspect that's really important to understand is that there's plenty of other used cars out there. So given the fact that a car has stains on their seat doesn't necessarily guarantee that the previous owner didn't care about the car. Maybe they did change it at regular intervals as far as changing their oil. But the problem is you don't necessarily know that. So if all I have is, stains on the seat to go off of, then I'm probably going to just go find a car that's equally comparable that doesn't necessarily have stains, because there's a greater likelihood anyways that that car was well taken care of. Now, the next thing to do when trying to really decide on whether or not the car was taken well care of is to thoroughly visually inspect it. And so I don't necessarily just mean, looking at the car, making sure there aren't stains. Look at, for example, the car door. That color may be silver, but you look at the bumper and it's a slightly off silver. It's not necessarily quite the same. That would indicate that maybe the door was changed or the bumper was replaced, or that at least had to be painted. So that means that it was either scratched up or maybe it actually got torn off altogether. Or, open up the hood and see if anything visually stands out. You don't necessarily have to be too intimidated by this, even if you don't know anything about cars. If I just open up the hood and, everything seems like it just has a little bit of dust on there, a natural amount, and I see one pipe there that seems brand new, then there's a good chance that pipe was replaced. You can go ahead and ask about that question. But like I said, once again, from the car dealership's perspective, they may not necessarily even know how it got replaced. So it's probably best to just stay away from that car and go look at a different car. Another inspection point that I typically would recommend most people to just stay away from is if you see any major water stains. So if I look at the floor of a car and I see that there's this waterline mark or water stain mark, then that would indicate to me that the car at some point was probably flooded, and that's definitely a car you want to stay away from. Obviously, there's some people out there that have the mechanical knowledge to get a good deal out of that car, but in general, I just recommend it's not worth your time or effort or even risking that potential stress of, that car breaking down. Another important part when it comes to inspecting a car is to check the check engine light. And, a lot of people will just visually check the check engine light and see if it's on or not. But what I actually recommend is getting an OBD reader. And I know this is going to sound intimidating to some people, but it's not. So all you have to worry about is you can actually take this car to O'Reilly or AutoZone and, when you're test driving it, and ask them to do an OBD reader test. And basically it's just a little insert that plugs typically underneath the driving wheel, and it will tell you whether or not the check engine light is on, because if the light bulb had gone out or someone actually took it out, then the check engine light wouldn't show you that, but it actually is on. Or another example of this would be if somebody disconnected the battery, it will actually reset those tests so the check engine light isn't on. But if you just drove that car just even 20 or 30 miles, sometimes that check engine light will actually kick back on. But you wouldn't know that if you only test drove it for 5 or 10 miles. So that's why I really highly recommend either getting an OBD reader, which you can get on Amazon or even Target in some cases for $50 to $100, or just taking to O'Reilly and getting it done for free. But speaking of which, going back to that test drive, when it comes to the test drive, obviously I highly recommend test driving the car, but I think people don't take it a step further. What you need to do is make sure you go in, low speed settings as well as high speed settings, back down to low speed, turn the steering wheel all the way right, turn it all the way left. Don't necessarily just wobble it left and right, because sometimes it's not enough to indicate the major problems. A good example of this would be there's a lot of cars out there that do just fine when you're just driving around through a neighborhood. You could drive around through a neighborhood for 30 minutes and it wouldn't be a problem. But the moment you go to the highway speeds and have it go up to 60, 70 miles per hour and then back down to a stoplight, the car will actually stall out, or when it's idling, it will actually stall out. And you wouldn't necessarily know that unless if you actually test drove it in a variety of settings. And then when it comes to test driving too, make sure all the different indicators work. Make sure that the internal indicators, so if I'm doing my turn signal, that it actually works on the inside, as well as the exterior lights. Make sure all the different lights work, all the different components work that they're supposed to, because this is going to be the final chance you have when it comes to working with a car dealership to have them replace it or to have them knock off that price. Usually my recommendation is just have them replace it if it's something that you actually care about. But if something is that you're not going to use, like it's some kind of latch on, some kind of internal compartment, and you don't necessarily care about that too much, then just have them knock it off the price. The other thing I would say when it comes to test driving the car or testing out different components of the car is don't be too soft on the car. Some people will very cautiously close the door when they're test driving a car, but that's not necessarily how you're going to typically close the door. Or another example is they want to make sure that the tires are on tight, right? So they go grab the tire and they just wiggle it around barely. But no, I grab the tire and, really try to move it, make sure it stays on there. And if not, then the lug nuts are either defective or they're not on tight enough. So, really test out the car that you normally use it. And the last part I want to recommend as far as my general tips on buying a used car from a dealership is the whole car negotiation process. And I'll actually cover in a separate video if those are interested in more detail on the specific techniques that a car salesman is using and how to kind of counterbalance those techniques that they're using. But in general, from a car salesman's perspective, the two main things that they're trying to do is kind of pressure you to buying the car as quickly as possible, because there's a statistic that I think if somebody walks out the door that, there's only a 30% chance that they'll actually return to buy the car. So it's in their best interest to keep you there as long as possible. So that's why the whole car negotiation process takes very long. Sometimes I'll have you sit there at the desk and say, let me go ask my manager whether or not that new price that we're negotiating at is acceptable or not. And then they'll be gone for 30, 45 minutes, even though there's nobody else at the car dealership. They're doing that on purpose. The other aspect that car salesmen typically use that works to their advantage is basically bundling all these decisions. Like I said, with the financing process, that's very hard to know when they change the interest rate, as well as the purchase price, as well as the monthly payment. It's just really hard to know if you're getting a good deal or not. So be very vigilant to that. But the other aspect they really do this with is the trade-in value. So a good example of that is I actually negotiated a car one time where the original purchase price was, let's say, $12,000. And I ended up negotiating down to $10,000, but I didn't necessarily focus on the trade-in value of the car. But so when I ended up saying, okay, well, I agree to that $10,000, but I don't want to trade in my car anymore, I'm going to just go ahead and sell it individually because, I don't necessarily think I am getting a great deal here. They ended up saying that they couldn't sell the car anymore at that $10,000 purchase price. And the reasoning, which is kind of obvious, is that they were giving too good of a deal on the car because their trade-in value was going to make up that difference. They were basically paying me so low on that trade-in value that they didn't necessarily care about losing more money on the purchase price of the car. So when it comes to the trade-in value of the car, what I generally recommend here is to get a top line price. So go to, Kelley Blue Book Value and search your car, put all in your specs, and see what you would actually get if you sold it to a private individual. And usually I would basically gauge it lower. People like to say their car is in excellent condition when in reality it's either in good or poor condition. So I generally recommend, just going with the good condition. So that will be your top of the line price that you could potentially get for your trade-in value because you could actually sell it. And then go to CarMax, and that will actually work as your lowest possible trade-in value, because CarMax will typically give you a trade-in value that's fairly low, but the benefit is you don't necessarily have to buy directly from them. They'll actually give you a cash offer for your car. So then now that I know that, if I go to the car dealership, the used car dealership, and they're offering me something lower than, let's say, they're offering at CarMax, then I know I'm not necessarily getting a great deal on that trade-in value. And the opposite obviously being true too. If they're giving me a trade-in value very, very close to what I could sell to a private individual, then they're actually giving me a really great deal for that trade-in value. So that's it for this video when it comes to buying a used car from a dealership. If you have any other questions, feel free to comment down below. I know it's a lot of information and there's a lot to cover because it really is an important decision, especially when it comes to your own personal finance. And if you appreciated this video, all I ask in return is to just hit that like button. It would really help me out. And if you like personal finance, business, or the learning more about how to buy a car, or if you want to learn more about the first-time home buying experience, those are general topics I love talking about. So you're going to want to hit the subscribe button to stay tuned for more.